Fog lay thick upon the cobbled streets of Belgravia that morning, muffling hooves and hiding faces. At precisely 7:30, a constable pounded on the door of 18 Cavendish Square, the residence of Lady Eleanor Bracknell, heiress to the vast Bracknell shipping fortune. The servants had discovered her drawing-room window smashed from the inside, the place in disarray, and, most disturbingly, Lady Eleanor herself gone without a trace. Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard arrived. Shortly thereafter, his moustache twitching with unease as he surveyed the wreckage. The glass shards lay scattered inward, contradicting the servants' accounts. A letter opener smeared faintly with blood rested on the carpet, yet no blood trail followed. Lady Eleanor's bed had not been slept in, her jewellery untouched, her luggage present and packed as if for a journey she had never taken. And upon the mantel, in immaculate script, a single line from Tennyson, "There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die." By 9 o'clock, Sherlock Holmes stood in the drawing-room, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed. Dr. Watson, stood by the fireplace, glancing again at the cryptic verse. "You've ruled out forced entry?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively casual. Gregson nodded. "All windows bolted. The window there," he pointed to the one in question, "was smashed from within. No one saw her leave. No footprints in the garden. No coach. Nothing." Holmes knelt beside the blood-streaked letter opener. "This was used recently." "Yes, but only to nick the skin. A staged wound, perhaps, staged by interjected." "You mean to mislead?" "Quite. Consider, Watson, if one wishes to disappear, one might stage an abduction. But then, why leave behind a quote about blind duty?" Holmes stood and paced the room. A red herring, or perhaps a cipher. He examined the room again, with painstaking care. "What of the servants? All loyal?" In tears, Gregson replied, "The maid says Lady Eleanor was upset last evening after receiving a telegram." "Where is it?" "No trace. We checked the study. Empty." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Then that is our missing piece." We returned to Baker Street by midday. Holmes sat in silence for much of the journey, fingers drumming upon his knees. He spoke only once. "Watson, remind me what you recall about Lord Cedric Bracknell." "Her father died 3 months ago. Heart failure. Buried with great ceremony. Left Eleanor everything. Precisely everything. At our flat, Holmes summoned a footman from the Bracknell estate. The young man, Thomas, arrived pale and twitching. "Tell me about Lady Eleanor's disposition since her father's death," Holmes said without preamble. She was withdrawn, sir, stopped attending society balls, refused visits. She burned letters, said she had no wish for the inheritance." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Burned letters? What kind? From Mr. Richard Verney, her former fiancé?" Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, I believe we've found our motive. And our ghost." I frowned. "You think Verney is involved?" "I think the question is rather who was Lady Eleanor trying to protect." The next morning, we took a hansom to Clerkenwell, too. The crumbling townhouse Verney had inherited from his father. The place reeked of disuse and damp paper. Yet within the drawing-room, neatly stacked, were ledgers each marked Bracknell Shipping Co. Holmes examined them, silent. "You'll note," he said after a pause, "these contain transactions not listed in the official probate record." "You believe she falsified the records?" "No. I believe Lord Bracknell was hiding something, and Eleanor discovered it too late." Holmes turned to Vernet, who had emerged from the shadows, haggard and trembling. "You're hiding her," Holmes said quietly. I had no choice." Vernet whispered. "They'll kill her." "Who?" Vernet held up a telegram. Holmes snatched it. It read, "You inherit the lies, speak, and die. MM." Holmes muttered. Not a signature. "A warning," Vernet broke, "before he died. Lord Bracknell confessed something to Eleanor. He said the company's profits were rooted in smuggling arms, opium. He feared exposure. Eleanor swore to end it all. But someone who profits from it found out." "Why not go to the police?" I asked. "Because the man behind it is untouchable, Maurice Holden. He's in Parliament." She thought, if she vanished, the estate would freeze. No power of attorney, no profit. Holmes's mouth twitched. Ingenious, but insufficient. If Holden discovers she's still alive, she's gone to France, Vernet whispered, disguised. She thinks she'll gather proof and expose him abroad. Holmes stood. "Then we must move faster." We departed at once, instructing Gregson to discreetly issue a warrant for Holden's arrest. On unrelated grounds, tax evasion, if necessary. Holmes, meanwhile, wired Lestrade at Calais to intercept Eleanor and bring her safely back to London under guard. 3 days later, she returned alive, shaken, but determined. She brought with her the final ledgers, the proof of Holden's laundering schemes, bribes, and foreign dealings. By week's end, Holden was under arrest. Lady Eleanor, after lengthy testimony in Parliament, officially renounced her claim to the Bracknell fortune and announced its conversion into a relief trust for those harmed by her family's dealings. "You see, Watson," Holmes remarked one evening as we sat by the fire, "some mysteries are not solved by logic alone, but by courage, the kind that walks away from power rather than toward it." And the Tennyson quote. Holmes smiled faintly. A misdirection, yes, but perhaps also the reminder. She chose not to reason why, but to do. And by doing, she gave others a chance to live. The fog still lay on London, but in that moment, it felt a little less thick. Holmes sat motionless at the edge of Baker Street's sitting room, the sunlight crawling through the drapes and sketching long lines across the Persian rug. The case had unfolded quickly in the past few days, too. Quickly, in fact, for his liking. Holden's arrest had shaken the House of Commons and won Lady Eleanor many supporters in the public eye. Yet Holmes's violin sat untouched, the bow resting unused for days. And this alone told me something gnawed at him. He stood abruptly. "Watson, something is wrong." I lowered my newspaper. In what sense? She was too composed. Lady Eleanor, precisely. Holmes began pacing. She re-entered London after faking her own disappearance, learned that her would-be killer had been caught, and presented damning evidence that should have terrified her for weeks. And yet, her voice never wavered, no stammer, no hesitation, not even when speaking before Parliament. She has the nerves of a soldier, yes, but not of one hiding from assassins. Do you believe she wasn't in danger? I believe. Holmes stopped, then turned toward the fireplace. I believe she never left. I rose from my chair. Holmes, she was seen in Calais. Lestrade confirmed it. Exactly. He smiled faintly, confirmed, as if that alone satisfies the question, before I could respond. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes snatched it eagerly, then read aloud, from Inspector Lestrade. The woman identified herself as Eleanor. Bracknell. Passport confirmed. Voice matched. She travelled under guard to Victoria. Holmes tossed it into the fire. You see, Watson, everyone's been busy confirming what they were told to confirm. But no one asked the right question why she staged her return. He retrieved his coat, hat, and cane. Come, we're paying Lady Eleanor a visit. The Bracknell townhouse had been scrubbed of its earlier disarray. The window had been repaired, and the blood-stained carpet removed. Lady Eleanor received us in the same drawing-room, dressed in dark violet, with a velvet ribbon around her throat and a book of Latin verse in her lap. She offered Holmes her hand and a placid smile. "You've come to check on me, Mr. Holmes?" "Something like that," he said smoothly. "We've been revisiting the details of your disappearance. Some elements remain unclear. I'd imagine many would," she replied. "It was chaotic. Indeed, your belongings were left behind. Even your gloves, and yet a woman of your stature would never leave unprepared, especially when intending to cross into France under disguise." Her smile flickered. "I was in danger, Mr. Holmes." "Were you?" He took a step forward. "You left a verse behind. You arranged for a window to be broken inward, not out. And yet you expected us to believe you were taken. But what strikes me most is that you burned letters, then chose to leave a cryptic trail of your intentions anyway, as if you wished someone to follow it." Her eyes hardened. "Is there a question here, or a performance?" Holmes smiled. "What color is your passport, Lady Eleanor?" She blinked. "Excuse me, the document you used to cross into France. You produced it at Calais." "Yes." "What color was it?" She hesitated, and for a brief second her gaze dropped not to her hands, but to the fireplace, as if wishing the question would burn away. "Green," she said finally. Holmes's voice turned cold. "British passports are blue, my lady." The silence hung heavy. She stood then, slowly, her hands smoothing her skirt. "You're very clever, Mr. Holmes. But cleverness can be dangerous." Holmes inclined his head. "So can a false heiress." The door opened behind us. Vernet entered, but he froze at the sight of Holmes's expression. "She knows," Holmes said simply. Vernet's face drained of color. "Eleanor, please." "She's not Eleanor," Holmes said. "She is Catherine Bracknell, cousin to Eleanor, daughter of Lord Bracknell's disgraced brother, and the woman who fled to America after a quiet scandal involving forged estate bonds. 5 years ago." I stared. That's why she was so calm. She never feared discovery because she planned it. Catherine gave a faint laugh. Your friend is very quick, Mr. Vernet. Quicker than you said. Vernet stepped forward. You told me Eleanor asked you to help. That she wanted to. Bring Holden down. That she needed a stand-in to protect herself while she gathered proof. You said she chose you. She did. Catherine whispered, a hint of sadness beneath the defiance. But not for this. I was meant to act as her decoy. She trusted me with her name, her plan, even her accounts. She's dead, isn't she? Holmes asked softly. Catherine did not answer. Holmes turned to Vernet. You suspected it. That's why you hesitated when we found the ledgers. She died the night she disappeared. Holmes said. That's why the trail had no blood. She was poisoned, perhaps. In tea, then buried somewhere discreet. Her decoy stepped in before the servants could discover the truth. Catherine closed her eyes. I didn't kill her. Then who? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. She was going to confront Holden herself. She asked me to prepare her statements, her escape. But the night before, she received a visitor. I was upstairs. I only heard raised voices, and the next morning she was gone. Holmes's gaze sharpened. And you buried her. I didn't know what else to do. Her papers were ready, the ledgers complete. The world needed the truth. I thought I could be her, just long enough to finish what she started. Vernet dropped into a chair, his hands in his hair, and Holden guilty, as ever, but not the killer. Holmes stepped forward. You said Eleanor was planning to go public. That means someone else feared exposure more than Holden. He turned toward me. Watson, summon Gregson, quietly, and have him bring the original estate solicitor, Mr. Ambrose. I nodded and left. Catherine's eyes widened. You think Ambrose? Holmes merely stared into the fireplace. He handled Lord Bracknell's estate. He knew about the off-record ledgers. And if Eleanor had declared the will invalid or restructured the company, he stood to lose everything. Catherine leaned against the mantel, shaken. I only wanted to finish her work. I never meant. You meant well, Holmes said. But deception, even in mourning, carries its cost. As the faint sound of wheels approached outside, Holmes turned to the window. Let us hope Mr. Ambrose has a clear conscience, because the truth now cannot hide any longer. Gregson arrived not long after Watson returned, the carriage wheels crunching softly over the wet gravel outside. With him came Ambrose, the Bracknell family's solicitor, dressed in an impeccable grey morning coat. His hair parted so precisely, it seemed drawn with a ruler. He carried a long-handled umbrella and an air of effortless confidence, as though he were arriving not to answer questions about a murder, but to settle an afternoon estate review. Mr. Holmes, he said crisply, as he entered the drawing-room, nodding politely to the rest of us. Inspector, Doctor, Miss Bracknell. His eyes lingered on Catherine, just long enough to reveal a flicker of doubt. He had known the real Eleanor, Holmes noticed, but said nothing. Holmes didn't offer a seat. He folded his arms and looked at Ambrose like a chemist might examine an unstable compound. Thank you for coming, Mr. Ambrose. I presume you've heard about Maurice Holden's arrest, of course. Thoroughly deserved. Disgraceful man. And yet, 4 years, your office facilitated the transfer of Bracknell funds into shell accounts controlled by him. Ambrose blinked, just once. You misunderstand. I handled routine transactions as directed by Lord Bracknell. If Holden misused those accounts, I had no knowledge. And Lady Eleanor, Holmes asked, was she aware? Ambrose cleared his throat. She began asking questions. Yes. Around the time of her father's death, she mentioned she might revise the estate's structure, move funds into philanthropic trusts. I encouraged her to take time, not rush into anything emotional. Did she seem unstable? Not at all, Ambrose said quickly, and then too quickly added, though grief can manifest unpredictably. Holmes's gaze narrowed. And the night she disappeared, I was not present. No, but you were expected, Holmes said. Ambrose's composure faltered. He looked toward Catherine, then away. She had requested the draft agreement for restructuring the shipping division. I was meant to deliver it that evening, but I delayed. Business elsewhere. May we see that draft? Ambrose's lips tightened. Unfortunately, it was destroyed after she vanished. I assumed it was no longer relevant. Holmes's silence lingered long enough to grow uncomfortable. Then he gestured to the chair. Sit, Mr. Ambrose, as the solicitor lowered himself onto the edge of the seat. Watson stepped in with a fresh cup of tea for him untouched. Catherine remained near the fireplace, arms crossed, her gaze flicking between the men. Holmes circled. You said she began asking questions after her father's death. You discouraged her from acting in haste. But when she disappeared, leaving behind no sign of struggle, you made no effort to pursue the truth. Why? Ambrose bristled. I am not a detective, Mr. Holmes. I do not chase ghosts. No, Holmes said. You help bury them. Ambrose stood abruptly. If you have an accusation, but Holmes cut across him. Not yet. But I find it curious that a man with access to every detail of the Bracknell estate claims ignorance about its legal dealings, especially when those dealings began only after you assumed management 5 years ago. Ambrose paled. Thank you, Holmes said coolly. That will be all for now. Ambrose left stiffly. The moment the door closed, Holmes turned to Catherine. You said Eleanor received a visitor that night. A man's voice. She nodded. I didn't hear much. Just raised voices. Something about betrayal. Ambrose has the voice of a man who rarely raises it. Holmes muttered. He plays puppet master. Someone else had passion that night. I can help. A voice offered from the doorway. We turned. It was Thomas, the footman. He stood awkwardly in the corridor, cap in hand. I know I shouldn't be listening, sir, but I was there that night. I saw something. Holmes stepped closer. Go on. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. It was late, near midnight. I'd gone to the kitchen for tea. I saw Lady Eleanor, real Lady Eleanor, on the stairs. She looked pale, like she'd been crying. She said she was expecting someone. A cousin, she said, from America. He turned slowly to Catherine. She asked me to fetch sherry. When I came back, she was speaking to a man in the parlor. I only saw him from behind. Tall, broad, hair going grey. Holmes's eyes lit with sudden clarity. Not Ambrose, not Vernet. Who then? Thomas hesitated. I didn't know. I never saw him leave. In the morning, she was gone. The house was quiet, but the fire had burned through the night. Holmes turned to Watson. Do you recall who Eleanor mentioned in her last letter? Watson furrowed his brow. She referenced an uncle, someone who led father astray. Holmes nodded. Lord Bracknell's brother. Catherine's breath caught. My father. Precisely. He fled to the Americas under scandal, but returned in secret. And if Eleanor meant to strip his last lifeline the fortune he once considered, his by right he may have seen that as betrayal beyond forgiveness. Gregson looked up from his notebook. We can find him. Holmes raised a hand. He's still here. I believe he never left London. He's hiding in plain sight, moving between safe houses or perhaps even staying with someone he trusts. Catherine turned pale. You think I would shelter him? I think he came to you first. But not as a killer, as a man in desperation. And when you refused, he went to Eleanor. She didn't answer, which was answer enough. Holmes turned to Gregson, put an alert across the ports. Name, Charles Bracknell. Age, late 50s. Grey hair. Last seen near Cavendish Square. Gregson nodded and left. Only then did Holmes finally sit. The voices lie, Watson, or bend. Slightly, like a warped mirror. Ambrose plays ignorant to avoid. Implication. Catherine plays Eleanor to finish her cousin's mission. But the true deception began before any of them knew when Charles Bracknell returned. Not to make peace, but to claim revenge. And now, having killed his niece, he is loose in London with nothing to lose. Watson said quietly, Do you think he'll strike again? Holmes stared out the window, the fog thickening in the glass. He already has, he said, and unless we move quickly, the next voice to go silent may be Catherine's. Outside, the fog had thickened into a white curtain, draping London in silence. Inside Baker Street, Holmes sat at his desk, every surface around him cluttered with maps, ledgers, half-burned letters, and overlapping sheets of paper covered in his sharp handwriting. A single oil lamp cast long shadows, flickering across his face as he stared at a list of names, a list that had grown considerably, longer since the night Lady Eleanor vanished. Watson stood near the window, watching the street, his brows furrowed. No movement since morning, he said. If Charles Bracknell is still in London, he's in no hurry to reveal himself. He's not hiding for fear, Holmes murmured. He's hiding for strategy. He tapped his pen against the paper. Too many motives, Watson. Too many threads that refuse to weave together. Then we cut the ones that no longer belong, Watson suggested. Holmes looked up, and for a moment, his eyes glinted with something like satisfaction. Just so. He rose and picked up the file on Richard Vernet. Vernet had the most obvious reason to be involved, a former fiancé with a ruined reputation, whose return coincided neatly with Eleanor's disappearance. And yet he'd brought us the ledgers, risked exposure to support her mission. Unless that was all a clever act. He seemed genuinely shocked when he discovered the truth about Catherine. Watson said, "Perhaps, but even honest men lie when love is involved." Holmes walked to the fireplace and stared into the smouldering coals. He also loses everything if Eleanor is dead. There were left no provisions for him. Their engagement had ended. But if she had restructured the estate and created a trust, as she intended, Vernet may have found his way back into influence. You think he knew she was going to confront Charles that night? Holmes shook his head. He says he didn't, and I believe him. Why? Because Vernet is an emotional man. If he had suspected Charles killed her, he wouldn't have stood calmly in that parlor. He would have gone after him. Watson nodded slowly. Then Ambrose? Holmes sighed. Ambrose is methodical. He'd rather poison a ledger than a person. His motive was preservation of his firm, his reputation, his delicate little empire. If Eleanor had publicly exposed the estate's criminal finances, he would have faced ruin. That gives him motive. Yes, but no opportunity. He wasn't in the house that night. That I've confirmed. Holmes returned to the list. That leaves only two who were truly present. Catherine, Watson said. Holmes paused, and Thomas. Watson blinked. The footman. You can't be serious. I am never anything else. He turned, moving quickly now, the pace of his thoughts accelerating. Catherine had motive, perhaps. Guilt, perhaps ambition. But I now believe her story is mostly true. She did not kill Eleanor. She buried her to protect her cousin's legacy, not destroy it. Then the boy? Thomas said he heard voices that night, that he fetched sherry, that he saw a man from behind. But he didn't say he saw Eleanor after that. Holmes paced. What if she never made it to the parlor? What if she died in the stairwell? What if the man she expected, Charles Bracknell, never came at all? Watson frowned. Then who did? Holmes's gaze darkened. Someone who stood to benefit from her death before she met with Charles. Someone who intercepted her, quickly and quietly. He crossed to the coat stand and pulled a telegram from his inner pocket. This came an hour ago, from the station. Master at King's Cross, on the night of Eleanor's disappearance. A man matching Thomas's description deposited a trunk with the name C. Bracknell, and left instructions for it to be sent to York the same day the false Eleanor surfaced. In Calais. Watson's face hardened. So Thomas knew. Holmes nodded. More than knew. He participated. But why? He's a servant. What does he gain? Holmes spoke softly, gravely. Because he is not simply a servant. He is Catherine's half-brother, son of Charles Bracknell. His real name is Thomas Hale. Watson stared. They planned it together, perhaps, or perhaps he acted alone, out of loyalty to his disgraced father. Maybe he discovered Eleanor's intentions, found out she meant to destroy the Bracknell fortune once and for all. Maybe Charles reached out to his daughter and asked her to delay Eleanor's plans. But when Eleanor refused, Thomas acted. Perhaps even before Charles arrived. Perhaps he acted instead of him. A knock rattled the door. Gregson entered, breathless, his hat in hand. "We've found the father," he said. "Charles Bracknell. Rented a room in Limehouse under a false name. Left yesterday. Holmes's expression did not change, and Thomas vanished, took nothing from the servants' quarters, disappeared some time before dawn. Holmes turned to Watson. The maze is closing in, but the path is clearer now. Charles planned to use Catherine to recover influence. But when Eleanor refused to negotiate, Thomas, loyal to his father, perhaps blindly removed the obstacle. Catherine, caught between blood and conscience, did not expose him. Instead, she stepped into Eleanor's shoes to salvage the cause. And now Thomas is gone, Watson said. Holmes picked up his coat and hat. Not for long, he said. He's young, rash, and desperate, but he's not clever. And desperation leaves a scent sharper than blood. He turned to Gregson. Put agents on every outbound train, ship, and stagecoach. Focus on York and Glasgow, and send his photograph to the Royal Mail. He may try to collect something under the Bracknell name. Gregson nodded and left. Watson followed Holmes to the door. You think Catherine knew? I think she feared it. But knowing and proving are different things. Guilt hides in silence far more comfortably than in lies. They stepped out into the cold night, the city stretching ahead of them like a puzzle still missing its final pieces. Greed and guilt, Holmes murmured. The twin poisons of the heart. Let us hope we arrive before they do further damage. And into the fog they walked, chasing the last shadow in a story built from broken names, tangled loyalties, and one heiress who had tried to escape her. Inheritance only to be buried by it. The morning came colder than the last, with the kind of dry, metallic light that made every stone corner of London feel unwelcoming. At Scotland Yard, Inspector Gregson's voice buzzed with triumphant tension as he unfolded a thin sheaf of paper before Holmes, Watson, and myself. We've got him, he said. Thomas Halelius Bracknell was spotted in Doncaster trying to collect a bank transfer. He used Catherine's forged credentials. Fool walked right into the wire we sent. We've had him in custody since dawn. Holmes didn't smile. He leaned forward and examined the telegram, then looked at the inspector. What name was the transfer under? C. Bracknell. He was expecting funds from the Bracknell estate, though he didn't know we'd frozen everything. After the discovery of the falsified passport and Eleanor's posthumous testimony, Holmes tapped a knuckle on the edge of the desk. Thoughtful. Anything recovered on his person? False travel documents, tickets to Hull, and a letter. It's unsigned, but appears to offer him safe passage out of the country and a fresh start in Antwerp if he kept quiet. Likely Charles Bracknell, the father, sent it. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And the handwriting. Gregson blinked, still being compared. But I think we have enough to proceed. Don't you? I think. Holmes said carefully that Thomas is a frightened boy who's clever enough to forge a banking signature, but foolish enough to use it himself. That makes him complicit in a fraud, but not in a murder. Gregson bristled. He ran. He was told to. Holmes said, that letter is bait. The real spider's elsewhere. Gregson looked unconvinced. He confessed. To what? To disposing of Eleanor's body. Said he did it at his sister's request. Holmes's face remained still. Then, slowly, he stood. Inspector, Would you mind if I spoke with him alone? Gregson sighed. I suppose not. But we've got him dead to rights. Holmes, don't waste time looking for ghosts when the boy's giving you the body. Holmes didn't reply. The interview room was a cold, narrow space with thick brick walls and a single flickering gas lamp. Thomas sat slouched at the table, wrists cuffed before him, eyes bloodshot and sunken. When Holmes entered, he sat up straighter, but didn't speak. Holmes pulled a chair, placed it deliberately opposite, and sat. You told them you buried Eleanor. Thomas's jaw tightened. Yes. Where? Silence. Holmes tilted his head. You see the problem, Thomas. You confessed, and yet no one's found a grave. No body. No trace. Only your word. I'll tell them later. No, you won't. Holmes's voice darkened. Because it's not your lie. You're repeating someone else's. Thomas swallowed hard. You buried something, didn't you? A trunk. Maybe full of Eleanor's belongings. Maybe stained with something red. But not her. Because she died somewhere else. Thomas blinked rapidly. They said. Who? He looked away. Holmes leaned in. Tell me who said. Who gave you the instructions? Because I'll tell you what I think. I think you arrived after she was dead. I think you saw her on the stairs, perhaps, and panicked. Maybe you thought Catherine did it. Maybe you thought your father did, so you obeyed. You moved the body or what you thought was the body, but it was a ruse. There was no murder, at least, not the one you imagined. Thomas's voice came out hoarse. She wasn't dead. She was drugged, or unconscious, and you made her vanish. Thomas stared. Why dash-eyed? Holmes nodded. That's the part they never expected to resurface. That's why someone sent you the letter promising freedom, because you're the last loose end. Thomas's breath hitched. I don't know who wrote the letter. It came to the house. Catherine burned the envelope. Holmes stood. Thank you, Thomas. That will do. He returned to the outer office where Watson waited, arms folded. Gregson looked expectant. Holmes said nothing as he lit a cigarette, exhaled once, then turned to Gregson. Release him. What? Gregson barked. Holmes, he confessed. Yes, Holmes said. And so would you. If someone handed you a script and told you it was the only way to protect your sister. He lied. Only about the wrong thing. Gregson threw up his hands. You're impossible. Holmes turned to Watson. I want to see Catherine again. Now, she was waiting at the Bracknell townhouse, dressed in black, the morning light casting a fine gleam on her copper hair. Her eyes were unreadable. I heard, she said, they've arrested Thomas. Briefly, Holmes replied, but I'm afraid he's not the threat I came to discuss. Her fingers tensed around the edge of the settee. I believe you acted out of loyalty, Holmes said. But now I need the truth. She closed her eyes. I told you everything. I knew. Not everything. You left out the most important detail: why Eleanor changed her mind about her plan. Her eyes snapped open. Holmes stepped closer. She was going to meet Charles Bracknell. Yes, but not to argue, not to beg, to offer a deal. Catherine said nothing. She wanted to protect the family's reputation. Catherine, not destroy it. She offered Charles a choice: confess and disappear, or she would cut off every remaining asset. He refused. He left. Catherine swallowed hard. He told me afterward that she threatened him. She didn't. She warned him. But someone else listened to that conversation. Someone who stood to lose everything if Charles was removed from the picture. Catherine's mouth parted, just slightly. Holmes continued. It was you. A beat of silence. The ticking clock was suddenly too loud. You were the final link. He said, not Charles. He left in anger, but you stayed behind. And that night, you made a choice. She stood, quietly, as if expecting the accusation. Eleanor was unconscious. Perhaps from the brandy. You thought she was dead. You panicked. You called your brother. And then you staged the disappearance. You never meant to harm her. But when she awoke days later, you had already assumed her life. And now, she is the last voice you need to silence. Her voice came softly. You think she's alive. Holmes stepped closer. She is. She's been in hiding watching. I received a letter yesterday. No name, but the handwriting was hers. Catherine's face crumbled, then not in guilt, but in terror. She'll ruin everything, she whispered. Holmes said nothing. I tried to fix it, she murmured. To do something good with it. I didn't want her dead, I just wanted her quiet. Holmes turned to Watson. She will return now. And as the lamplight grew long in the parlor, Catherine Bracknell, heiress by deception, sat silently by the window, knowing that her false victory had ended. The truth, long buried, was walking back into the world. The letter had arrived on soft cream paper. The edges curled faintly, as if it had been handled many times before being sent. There was no signature, no return address, only a line of handwriting unmistakable to Sherlock Holmes. I never meant for any of it to happen. I will return when it's safe. There is more to this than even you suspect. The curves of the letters, the pressure of the pen all bore the distinct marks of Eleanor Bracknell's hand. And Holmes had studied it too many times to doubt. He held the letter between thumb and forefinger like a fragment of living history, his eyes distant as his mind churned. Watson stood quietly by the hearth, watching the detective the way a physician watches a patient caught in fevered trance. The silence lengthened until Holmes finally spoke. Not to Watson, but to the room itself. Catherine believed Eleanor died the night of the confrontation, he murmured. But something changed. Something after that moment, something old, long buried, and just now starting to bleed. He walked to his files, fingers flicking through the drawers like a man chasing ghosts. He pulled a faded leather-bound folio, cracking it open to a case from 5 years prior. Watson, he said without looking up, do you remember the Penmore forgery? Watson frowned. Of course. That solicitor, Weatherby, who embezzled half a dozen estates through phantom trusts, wasn't he sentenced to 10 years? 8. Holmes corrected. Released early, vanished since. But one of his accomplices was never identified. The person who signed the Bracknell ledgers. Back then, under the name C.B. Watson, straightened. You think it was Charles Bracknell? I did, Holmes said, until I studied the signatures again this morning. Eleanor's letter provided the key. He flipped to sheets side by side, one from the Penmore case, the other from the Bracknell estate, and placed Eleanor's recent letter beside them. Watson leaned in. The resemblance was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Holmes pointed to the looped K, the tight spacing, the flourish at the end of the L. The same hand wrote them all, Holmes said. But not Charles, and not Eleanor either. Watson stared. Catherine. Holmes nodded once. She forged the ledgers for her father. She helped siphon the funds, possibly before she left for America. But here's the truth buried beneath it all. This crime didn't begin with Eleanor's disappearance. It began with her father's disgrace. Catherine didn't just replace Eleanor. She replaced herself. She erased her old life and returned as someone reborn. Watson sank into the armchair. Then her motive wasn't fear of exposure, it was fear of history repeating itself, of the past resurfacing. Holmes's voice was low. Or worse, fear that Eleanor would dig it up herself. He began pacing. Eleanor had been going through the ledgers for months. She must have found the forged entries, traced them back, and realized someone close to close was involved. Perhaps she didn't know it was Catherine, not at first. But she knew the danger, and she planned to confront it. Her meeting with Charles that night wasn't about estate reforms. It was a test to see if he would confirm her suspicions. But he fled, and that's when the trap snapped shut. Watson rubbed his temple. So Eleanor disappears. Catherine steps in. Thomas disposes of something, but the real question remains unanswered. Where is Eleanor now? Before Holmes could reply, there was a knock. Lestrade entered with a file in hand and a puzzled expression. "We've combed the Bracknell summer estate, just as you requested," he said. "Found an old writing desk in the library wing. Bottom drawer was stuck. We forced it open." He handed Holmes the contents, a small stack of sealed envelopes, untouched, bearing the same wax insignia. Holmes opened the top one. His face hardened. Watson stepped beside him. Inside was a confession dated 6 months before Eleanor's disappearance. It was written in Charles Bracknell's hand, addressed to Eleanor herself. It detailed the embezzlement, the forgeries, and most damning of all, the name of his accomplice, Catherine. She knew, Holmes said. Long before the confrontation, she confronted him not to negotiate, but to confirm, to corner him. And he confessed, Watson said, stunned. So she planned her next move. Holmes nodded. But someone else got there first. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back. She hid these letters, perhaps intending to make them public after she restructured the estate. But someone found them first. Someone who needed them buried forever. Lestrade exhaled. "So what do we do now?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "We draw them out," he said. "We tell the world that Eleanor is returning, that she's alive. We publish a notice in every major paper, announce that she'll speak at the Bracknell estate to address the scandal. We force the hand of whoever still believes they can silence her." Watson stared. "You think they'll try again?" "I know they will." And as the three men stood in the dimming light of Baker Street, the shadows of the past closed in tighter, no longer distant echoes, but the living, breathing, Roots of a crime far older than anyone had dared imagine. The truth was coming, and this time it would not be denied. The notice went out the next morning, spread across the Times, the Gazette, and even the more lurid broadsheets. Lady Eleanor Bracknell to reappear, statement on estate. Mismanagement to follow. The wording had been Holmes's own, precise, unmistakable, and laced with just enough ambiguity to cast doubt across every drawing room in London. By midday, the city rippled with it. Whispers spread through financial circles and among the gentry like a gas leak, invisible yet volatile. But it wasn't the public Holmes was baiting, it was the liar lurking beneath the Bracknell crest. Inside Baker Street, he set the final detail of the trap. On the desk sat a familiar velvet-lined box, closed and motionless. Watson eyed it warily. "You're sure this will work?" he asked. Holmes didn't look up. "I'm not after a confession, Watson. I'm after what cannot be confessed, only betrayed." "What's in the box?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Something Eleanor wore once, but Catherine never could." At precisely 4:30, the bell downstairs chimed. Catherine had come. She entered calmly, her usual composure intact, though a thin edge of tension betrayed her awareness of the notice. Her hair was pinned in a more formal style, her gloves immaculate, and she carried herself like a woman prepared to reclaim a throne or destroy it. Holmes gestured her toward the chair near the fire. "You've seen the papers, I assume?" Catherine nodded. "I imagine this is part of your performance." "You imagine correctly," Holmes replied. "But it's a performance for only one audience." She met his gaze without blinking. "You think you can frighten me into telling you something I don't know?" Holmes tilted his head. "I believe you know more than you think." He rose and walked slowly to the desk. "Tell me, Miss Bracknell, do you remember your cousin's locket?" Catherine's brow furrowed just faintly. "She had many pieces of jewelry," she said. "Not like this one." He opened the box. Inside lay a slender gold chain with a locket shaped like a tiny oak leaf, intricate, delicate, and old. It glinted faintly in the lamplight, and for the first time since she entered, Catherine's posture shifted, her breath stilled. It was given to Eleanor by her mother. Holmes continued. "Who died when she was 10. No other copy was ever made. It was her most treasured possession." Watson, seated across from her, noted the subtle contraction in her throat. Holmes saw it too. "She wore it nearly every day." Holmes went on, voice soft and deceptively casual. "Even on the night she disappeared, I confirmed it with Vernet and the maid who laid out her dress. It was part of her identity." He looked back to Catherine. "Yet you, Eleanor, never wore it. Not once." Her lips parted, a sharp breath escaping like air from a tight balloon. "It was lost," she said quickly, during the confusion. "I never." "No," Holmes said, stepping forward. "It was never lost. It was left behind. Because when you became Eleanor, you knew how she looked, how she spoke, even how she thought. But you didn't know what she cherished. And when Thomas buried her belongings, the locket wasn't among them." Catherine said nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the locket. Holmes placed the box gently in front of her. "Then tell me, if you are Eleanor. What is inside it? Her jaw tightened. Holmes smiled, just slightly. You see, I've never opened it either. Not until yesterday. He leaned over and pressed the clasp. The locket sprang open with a soft click dot inside, curled around a fragment. Of lavender paper was a tiny sketch, nothing more than two initials in a child's careful hand. E.B. and M.F. Below it, written in an even smaller line, was a date, August 7th, 1873. My guess, Holmes said quietly, is that it refers to Eleanor Bracknell and Mary Faulkner, childhood friends, perhaps, or a school companion. But if you were truly Eleanor, you would have remembered the name. Catherine looked at the locket as if it had turned into a blade. She did not speak. She did not look at Holmes. Instead, she slowly reached out, closed the lid, and folded her hands in her lap. I see, she said at last. Holmes didn't move. You rehearsed every detail, every habit. You convinced even Eleanor's closest companions. But the locket was never about appearance, it was memory. And that, I'm afraid, you could not borrow. Her voice was cold now, stripped of its warmth. What will you do with this? Holmes stepped back. That depends entirely on what you do next. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and something within her seemed to fall away, something brittle and old. The final thread of a long performance unraveling. She left me no choice, she said. Everything was already ruined. The name, the inheritance. My father couldn't survive prison, and neither could I know. Holmes replied. But you could have survived the truth. Catherine stood carefully. Her hands trembled now. Despite her composure, will you arrest me? That is not my duty, Holmes said. But the truth will not stay buried. Eleanor is alive. She will return. And when she does, I advise you to be far from London. She nodded slowly. Then this is the end of it. Holmes watched her step into the hall and heard the slow fall of her shoes on the stairs. When the door closed behind her, Watson exhaled. You believe she'll run? She already is, Holmes said. But not from us. From the shadow of who she once was and the truth that will follow her wherever she goes. He closed the locket box and placed it gently back on the desk. Sometimes, he reflected, it wasn't deduction or evidence that uncovered the truth. Sometimes, it was the absence of memory, the silence inside a keepsake that should have sung. The street outside to 1B Baker Street was still misted with evening drizzle. When Holmes returned from the yard, his overcoat was soaked to the elbows. Yet his expression remained unchanged, focused, cool, but faintly troubled in a way that only Watson could detect. He shook the moisture from his shoulders, removed his gloves, and dropped a single folded newspaper on the table between them. Watson leaned forward. The headline stared up at him like a bullet. Lady Eleanor Bracknell's return delayed. No statement at present time. Holmes sat in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. She read the announcement. Watson said, voice low. She read it. Holmes echoed. And so did the one person who feared it most. Watson scanned the article quickly. But why delay? Surely this would have been the moment for her to step forward. Holmes's eyes narrowed. She tried. He reached into his coat and pulled a thin envelope, damp but intact. This arrived an hour before I returned, delivered by hand. No name, no stamp, only this. He unfolded the letter and laid it out. The handwriting, unmistakably Eleanor's again, was firm but rushed. Holmes, do not announce again. The papers, the letters, all gone. I went to retrieve them. The drawer had been forced. The desk emptied. Someone has destroyed everything. I am being watched. I cannot move freely. Holmes's voice was quiet. The letters from Charles, the confession, the will, every tangible piece of evidence tying Catherine to the fraud and the estate to its ruin, they've all been removed. Watson stood, but the Summer estate was sealed. Holmes shook his head. Locked, yes, but not sealed. And someone with access, someone still clinging to power, had reason to bury what remained. He rose, crossed to the hearth, and stared into the embers, as if trying to read the movement of memory within flame. It's more than Catherine now, he said. She was clever, yes, but not ruthless. The destruction of that evidence, that's desperation. Watson frowned. Thomas? Holmes turned sharply. No, he's under watch, and besides, he doesn't have the mind for this. Not to erase a past so thoroughly it disappears from record. This was done by someone who has cleaned up messes before. Someone with practice. Charles Bracknell. Holmes nodded. It seems our ghost has finally returned. A knock came, then rapid, insistent. Watson crossed and opened the door to reveal Inspector Gregson, breathless, his collar soaked. Through. Holmes, he said without preamble. The Bracknell townhouse, someone broke in. The study's been torn apart. Same drawer where you found the letters. Everything inside's been burnt. Holmes didn't react, only turned to Watson and the servants. He asked Gregson, sent away on Catherine's orders. Only one guard at the rear entrance. Said he saw nothing. Holmes stepped toward the door, his voice firm. I want the names of every person who's visited the house in the last 48 hours. Staff, relatives, messengers, anyone. I want their statements re-examined and their alibis retested. And have someone verify the shipping manifests from the docks, especially those bound for Antwerp. Gregson hesitated. You think they're leaving? No. Holmes replied. I think they're sweeping the last crumbs before they do. When the inspector left, Watson turned to him. What do we do now? Without the letters, we have no confession. Without the locket, no proof of identity. Holmes's eyes flicked up. That's not entirely true. He crossed to his desk and retrieved a small, sealed pouch, one he'd kept hidden even from Watson. He untied it and placed its contents gently on the table. Inside were 3 items: a scorched scrap of one of Charles's letters with his seal, partially intact, a brass button engraved with the initials CB, and a lock of chestnut hair tied with a faded ribbon. Watson stared. You retrieved these from the desk. Before it was emptied, Holmes said. I suspected it might not remain untouched for long. This, he gestured to the button, came from Charles's old military uniform, confirmed by a tailor. In Knightsbridge, He claimed it had been brought to him for duplication months ago by a woman. Catherine, Holmes nodded, likely to forge some image of loyalty for Thomas or for herself. But the tailor kept the original, out of habit, and this, he touched the lock of hair, was Eleanor's. It was tucked inside the binding of a poetry book hidden behind the ledger shelves, a private copy of Keats, with her name inscribed. Watson exhaled. So we still have something. Barely, Holmes said. But enough. If Eleanor is alive, and we know she is then, she must still have one remaining copy of her mother's will. The true inheritance record. If we find it, everything else unravels. And if she doesn't, then we lose. That night, Holmes didn't sleep. The fire burned low while rain slicked the windows in thick, slow streams. At some point, near dawn, a note was slipped beneath the door. Watson, half dozing in the chair, jolted awake and retrieved it. Holmes read it silently, then again. There were only 5 words. They found me. Come alone. No signature. But none was needed. Holmes folded the paper slowly, stood, and took his coat. Watson moved to block him. You're not going without backup. I must, or she dies. And if it's a trap, Holmes turned to him. Then you follow. He stepped into the pale grey of morning, walking alone into the fog that had claimed so many truths. Somewhere out there, evidence was vanishing, and someone silent, practiced, and ruthless was still pulling strings behind velvet curtains, trying to erase not just the crime, but the very memory of it. But Holmes was already closer than they knew. The fog clung to the cobbles of Belgravia like a wet veil, distorting every sound and shape as Holmes moved silently through the narrow alleys behind the Bracknell estate. He followed the directions encoded in the note for streets east to north. A red lamppost beside a dry fountain. There, behind the shattered mouth of a long-abandoned greenhouse. The final corner turned into a blind alley, and at its end, half swallowed by ivy and rain, stood a carriage house long fallen into disuse. Holmes didn't hesitate. He opened the warped door and stepped inside. The stillness struck first. Then came the cold. The air smelled of damp stone, oil, and something faintly coppery. He moved with purpose, eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through broken slats. Shapes loomed: old wheels, crates, a leather saddle hanging like a carcass. And then he saw her. Eleanor Bracknell stood near the far wall, dressed in a man's overcoat too large for her frame, face pale and drawn, but unmistakably her. Her eyes locked on Holmes with a mix of relief and something deeper worry, perhaps, or dread. You came, she said softly. Holmes took one step forward. Of course. I didn't know where else to go. I've been watching Catherine watching the house. I thought I could wait it out until you exposed her. But someone else is involved. Someone worse. Holmes's voice was low. Charles. Eleanor shook her head. No, not just Charles. Someone who doesn't care about the estate or inheritance. Someone who wants to erase everything. My mother's legacy. Even me. A creak echoed from behind. Holmes spun, hand already, reaching inside his coat. Too late. The blow landed behind his right ear, sending a flash of white through his vision. His knees buckled, but he twisted with the fall, catching the shadow of a figure as the world tipped sideways and cold stone rose to meet his cheek. Boots moved toward Eleanor, a voice, rough and low. "You shouldn't have returned." There was no struggle, only a dull sound, Eleanor collapsing, breath escaping her lungs with a soft cry, and then silence. Holmes, dazed, forced one eye open. He saw the figure's back retreating, tall, broad-shouldered, and calm. Not Charles, not Gregson, someone else entirely. Then darkness closed when Holmes awoke. It was Watson's voice that reached him first. "Holmes! Holmes!" He blinked, light stabbing into his eyes, pain blooming where skull met flagstone. "You've been out nearly 15 minutes, Watson muttered, crouched over him, revolver in hand. "I followed as you asked. Found the place empty, door cracked. Thank God I wasn't slower." Holmes pushed himself upright, blood sticky behind his right ear. "Eleanor!" Watson's eyes were grim. Gone. No sign of her. Holmes stumbled to his feet, surveying the room. The imprint of her coat in the dust still remained, and beside it a scuff, heel-shaped, dragging back as if she'd been pulled. Holmes traced the marks to the carriage entrance, where fresh footprints too large to be hers disappeared into the mud beyond. "They didn't kill her," Holmes murmured. "Not yet. This isn't finished." Watson hesitated. "Why take her now?" Holmes's voice turned dark. "Because they know she's the last thread holding the truth together, and now they're going to try and make her vanish for good." They returned to Baker Street in silence, Holmes holding a cold compress to his skull as the weight of failure pressed into his chest. The window panes trembled faintly in the wind, and somewhere down the street a horse screamed in protest at the lash of rain. It was nearly midnight when Gregson arrived, face drawn. "I need you both to come to the yard," he said, stepping inside without invitation. "Now." Watson's brow furrowed. "What's happened?" Gregson glanced at Holmes, hesitated, then answered. "Charles Bracknell's been found dead." The words hit like iron. Holmes's posture stiffened. "Where?" he asked. "Private flat in Kensington. Locked from the inside. Shot in the chest. No note. No weapon found." Watson frowned. "Suicide? Unlikely," Gregson said. "There was one window open, barely wide enough for a man to slip through. No fingerprints, no witnesses, just him dead." Holmes stood slowly, movements deliberate. "Then we are no longer investigating a disappearance. We are hunting a killer." The room turned still. Gregson cleared his throat. "There's something else." He opened a folded sheet of thick parchment and passed it to Holmes. It was a will, signed Charles Bracknell, but the handwriting was not Charles's. Holmes studied the loops of ink, the pressed parchment, the seal that didn't quite align. Forgery," he murmured, rushed, desperate. "Someone killed him to seize control of what little remained." Gregson looked grim. "And it's already been entered into probate. If no one challenges it within 72 hours, it becomes law." Watson whispered, "Eleanor." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "She must be alive. She must have the real will." Gregson shook his head. We've checked every train, every port, every hospital. There's no sign of her. Holmes turned toward the window. His mind had already begun to spin mapping routes, timelines, motivations. Someone had struck at the heart of the Bracknell family not out of hatred, or even vengeance, but strategy. Piece by piece, they were erasing every obstacle to their prize. But they had made one mistake. They had left Holmes a live dot, and in the reflection of the rain-glazed glass, he saw his own eyes narrow not with doubt, but with resolve. The game had changed, but it was far from over. The fog clung thick against the windows of 2-1B Baker Street, muffling the city's noise into a kind of mournful hush. Holmes sat motionless in his chair, his eyes fixed on a barely touched cup of tea that had long since gone cold. He had not spoken for nearly an hour, his fingers tapping soundlessly against the carved wooden armrest. Watson, sitting opposite, was careful not to interrupt. He had seen this mood before when Holmes's mind slipped beneath the surface, past the noise and misdirection, hunting something deeper. And now, with Charles Bracknell murdered and Eleanor once again vanished, the silence was weighted with tension. When Holmes finally moved, it was sudden, a shift forward, elbows to knees, hands laced together as his gaze fell sharply on the fireplace mantel. "Watson," he said without looking up, "how many people knew about Eleanor's locket?" Watson blinked. "What? The locket? The one with the initials and the date inside? You remember I used it to test Catherine?" "Of course I remember. You said it proved she couldn't be Eleanor." Holmes nodded slowly. "And where did we find it?" "You said it had been among Eleanor's things left behind, unnoticed." "No, I found it. In a private box, one that Catherine never opened." Watson frowned. "So you're suggesting she never saw it?" "Exactly." Holmes stood, pacing now, the old energy returning to his movements. "And yet consider the moment in the carriage house, just before I was struck. The voice that said, 'You shouldn't have returned.' It wasn't Catherine's. It was deeper. Male. Charles. No. I've reviewed that voice in my mind over and over, and it didn't match his tone, his rhythm. But there was something in the phrasing. Returned. Not come back, not you're here, but returned. That word implies someone who was expected, someone whose presence disrupted a long-held plan." He stepped to the sideboard, retrieved a scrap of parchment from the envelope Eleanor had left him, and held it up to the light. "This letter written in haste, yes, but not in panic. The strokes are uneven, yet legible. Eleanor had experience writing under pressure. That suggests training or preparation. You believe she was expecting danger?" Holmes turned. "I believe she was planning for it." He laid out several documents on the table: the fake will, the tailor's receipt, the partial confession. Salvaged from the desk, and began aligning them in rows, muttering to himself. Watson came closer, scanning the items again, though they had been reviewed many times already. It was Watson who finally broke the silence. "What if it isn't about the inheritance?" Holmes looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Watson said, leaning over the papers, "what if the inheritance, the Bracknell estate, the money, the titles, all of it is a distraction? What if the real motive lies elsewhere? Holmes's eyes flashed. Say more. Watson pointed to the ribboned lock of hair that was hidden in a book of Keats. Not some ledger or legal text poetry. Personal, private. Then there's the date in the locket, August 7th, 1873. A child's scrawl. That's not estate-related. That's emotional, sentimental. Why preserve that unless it held meaning? Holmes took the lock of hair and sat again, now fully absorbed. Eleanor had a secret, he murmured. Not a crime, at least not in the legal sense, but something someone else couldn't allow to surface. Own thing that had to be buried. He paused. August 7th, 1873. His eyes narrowed. Watson, how old would Eleanor have been then? 10. Watson answered. Same age her mother died. Holmes shot upright. Exactly. And what if those initials in the locket MF were not a friend, but something else? A name deliberately erased from public record. A half-sibling, perhaps a servant's child. Someone the Bracknell family tried to hide. And you think, this hidden person is tied to the forgeries. Holmes paced faster now. No tied to the reason behind them. Think, Watson, if Charles or Catherine discovered Eleanor had a claim, that would fracture the legitimacy of the estate legitimacy, perhaps. Or a scandal involving her mother then suppressing her wouldn't just be about money. It would be about silencing history. He turned back to the documents, and that's when it struck me. He pulled out a folded advertisement from the Times, dated 3 weeks prior. It was an auction listing for rare volumes, one of which was Keats, a private edition, annotated by a woman named Margaret Faulkner. Margaret Faulkner, Holmes said. M.F. Watson's breath caught. You think she was Eleanor's mother's companion? I think she was more than that. Perhaps her confidant or lover. Perhaps even Eleanor's true mother. If so, the entire Bracknell legacy is built upon a lie, and someone's gone to lethal lengths to preserve it. There was a knock at the door then. Lestrade entered, uninvited but clearly urgent. We've got another problem, he said, holding a damp telegram. Security at Whitechapel Morgue. Just called. A woman's body's been delivered under an anonymous name. Bruising around the wrists. Drugged. Possibly drowned. Fits Eleanor's description. Holmes's face remained unreadable as he took the telegram. His eyes scanned it once. No, he said finally. That's not her. Lestrade blinked. You're sure? Holmes handed it back. To public. To fast. They want us to believe. She's dead. They want us to give up the chase. Watson's voice was hushed. Then she's still alive? Holmes nodded, a slow certainty settling in. Yes, and I now know where to find her. He turned to the table one final time and tapped. His finger on the Keats edition's entry. The book never went to auction. It was pulled at the last minute. Purchased privately. The buyer used a false name. But the delivery was made to a chapel estate in Surrey. A place abandoned since 1880 to burned in a fire. Never rebuilt. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That's where she's being held. And as the fog deepened around the windows, and the city drifted into sleep, the pattern long obscured by lies, death, and vanishing truths had finally begun to emerge. Not a conspiracy of greed alone, but of shame, buried lineage, and the desperate reach of those clinging to a crumbling name. Now it was no longer a matter of solving a mystery. It was a race to save what little truth remained. Holmes and Watson left the dimly lit rooms of Baker Street behind as the first tendrils of dawn seeped into the London sky, their destination the charred ruins of the Surrey Chapel estate. The coach rumbled over slick, uneven roads, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and ash. As the city's familiar haze gave way to the desolation of countryside left to shadow and silence, the ruins came into view, half swallowed by creeping ivy and skeletal trees, blackened beams protruding like the ribs of some long-dead beast. It was a place forgotten by time, a place where memories were meant to die. Holmes studied the scene intently. The fire was no accident. It was designed to conceal. Watson nodded grimly, but not well enough. Together, they moved through the collapsed arches and scattered remnants of stone walls. Among the rubble, Holmes's eyes caught a glinter, fragment of a locket, tarnished but unmistakable gold. He knelt and retrieved it. The leaf-shaped charm lay cracked, but intact. Inside, a faded inscription, "To my Margaret." Forever. Holmes's voice was low, almost reverent. The connection is deeper than any of us imagined. As they advanced, a muffled sound reached. Their ears a faint cry, desperate and ragged. Holmes's pace quickened, weaving through the debris toward a collapsed doorway. There, trapped beneath a fallen beam, was Eleanor herself, pale and weakened, but alive. Watson knelt beside her, easing the heavy timber away. "You're safe now," he assured her, supporting her trembling frame. Eleanor's eyes, weary but fierce, met Holmes's. "It's worse than you think," she whispered. "They weren't just after the estate. They wanted to erase my mother's truth and me along with it." Holmes listened closely as Eleanor recounted a hidden chapter. Her mother, Margaret Faulkner, was not merely a servant or companion, but the rightful heir to a portion of the Bracknell fortune. A secret claim suppressed by Charles Bracknell to maintain his power and reputation. The fire that destroyed the chapel was meant to bury the evidence and Margaret herself in memory. "But why kill Charles?" Watson asked quietly. Eleanor's gaze darkened. "Because he feared the past. Feared that if the truth surfaced, it would unravel everything he built. The forged will, the lies they were his shield. But someone else wanted more than just power. Someone wanted revenge." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And who is this someone else?" She hesitated, then said, "Thomas Bracknell." A chill fell over the group. Thomas, the loyal cousin. The man who seemed the most devoted to the family. Name now revealed as the mastermind behind the destruction and deceit. His motive was not mere greed, but a twisted obsession to protect the Bracknell legacy at any cost, even murder. Holmes's mind raced, piecing together the clues, the forged documents, the carefully orchestrated cover-ups, the disappearance and attempted silencing of Eleanor. Thomas's jealousy and fanaticism had turned lethal dot as Eleanor was tended to by Watson. Holmes moved silently, eyes sharp for the final confirmation. Hidden beneath a pile of scorched papers, he found a letter written in Thomas's hand confessing his actions in a moment of dark clarity. a chilling testament to a man driven to destroy the past to save his own future. Holmes folded the letter carefully. The truth was never just about inheritance or power, he murmured. It was about fear of losing identity, control, and the legacy that bound them all. The sun broke fully over the horizon. As the ruined shadows receded, revealing the tangled web of deception unraveled at last. The heiress who denied her inheritance was no longer alone, and justice, long delayed, was poised to prevail. The evening air outside the Bracknell estate was heavy with a thick mist, the kind that swallowed sound and blurred shapes into indistinct shadows. Holmes stood near the grand iron gates, his long coat brushing the wet gravel as he surveyed the grounds with a keen, unwavering eye. Watson was at his side, watching the darkened windows where the flicker of lamplight betrayed the presence of guests, invited under a single pretense to unmask a truth long buried beneath layers of lies. Holmes had spent the day orchestrating every detail of the evening's design, the telegrams, the rumors of Eleanor's recovery, the subtle warnings whispered to the household staff, all carefully planted to bait the man who had hidden behind a mask of loyalty for far too long. Thomas Bracknell, the last guardian of a crumbling legacy, the architect of deception, was about to find himself cornered. Inside, the guests gathered in the large drawing-room, relatives, servants, and a handful of trusted friends, each cast. Under the uneasy glow of the crystal chandelier, the air buzzed with anticipation. But it was Holmes who commanded the room's true gravity. He stepped forward, his voice clear and deliberate. "Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for coming. Tonight, what I am about to reveal will shake the foundation of the Bracknell name and uncover the truth behind the recent tragedies that have plagued this family." Thomas, seated near the hearth, maintained a practiced calm, his eyes betraying nothing. As Holmes paced slowly before him, the disappearance of Lady Eleanor Bracknell, the murder of Charles Bracknell, the forged were all part of a web spun to conceal a secret that none wished to face. Holmes paused, letting the weight of his words settle. This secret is rooted not in greed alone, but in fear, obsession, and the desperate attempt to rewrite history. He produced the letter from his coat, the one found in the ruins of the Surrey chapel. The room fell silent as Holmes read aloud passages, penned in Thomas's own hand, a confession laden with remorse and twisted justification. The letter detailed Thomas's actions, the arson, the intimidation, the murder, all in the name of preserving a legacy he believed was his birthright. Thomas's expression flickered, a shadow passing across his face as Holmes's words washed over the assembled company. When the reading ended, Holmes fixed his gaze upon him. "You were willing to destroy family, truth, and lives to keep your claim unchallenged." The room seemed to constrict, the tension thick as Thomas rose slowly. His voice was cold but strained. "You think you understand, Holmes? I protected what was left of the Bracknell name. Eleanor's existence would have brought ruin. Lies breed chaos." Holmes replied evenly, "Only lies brought chaos here. The truth, while uncomfortable, is the only path to justice." Suddenly, Thomas lunged toward the mantelpiece, grabbing a heavy bronze candlestick. The guests gasped as Holmes stepped aside with practiced agility, letting Thomas's fury expend itself on empty air. Watson moved in, but Holmes raised a hand. Let him make his choice. Thomas's breath came ragged as he dropped the candlestick, the fight leaving him. "I was born into this," he said, voice cracking. "It was never my fault." Holmes's tone softened, yet remained firm. "No one's fault but yours to face what you've done," footsteps echoed, and Eleanor appeared at the doorway, still fragile but resolute. Her eyes met Thomas's, steady and unyielding. "You stole my birthright," she said, "and tried to erase my existence. But I am here, and I will not be silenced." Thomas's shoulders sagged under the weight of exposure. Sirens approached in the distance, heralding the arrival of the constables. Holmes nodded to the officers as they entered. "Arrest this man. The evidence, the confessions, the witnesses, it's more than enough." As Thomas was led away, the tension in the room released like a long-held breath. Eleanor turned to Holmes and Watson, gratitude shining through exhaustion. Holmes's gaze softened, but his mind was already moving forward. The past can be buried, but it will always find a way to surface. Tonight, justice has reclaimed what was lost. Watson clapped Holmes on the shoulder. "Another case closed, but hardly an easy one." Holmes smiled faintly. "No case worth solving ever is, Watson." The night deepened, but the light of truth burned brighter than any shadow that dared to linger, and in the quiet streets of London, a detective's work was never truly done. The clatter of the policeman's wheels faded down the Bracknell estate's long driveway, swallowed quickly by the fog that had rolled in overnight. Eleanor stood at the doorway of the drawing-room, her frame still fragile, but her eyes resolute. Holmes and Watson remained nearby, quietly discussing the evening's events. The tangled web of deceit had unraveled. Thomas Bracknell's confession had brought closure to the series of murders, forgeries, and disappearances that haunted the family, or so it seemed. Holmes's gaze lingered on Eleanor, who clutched the delicate gold locket close to her chest. "It is done," she said softly. "The truth is finally free." Watson nodded, but Holmes said nothing. His sharp mind churned beneath calm features, dissecting every detail, searching for the faintest thread that might yet have been missed. Suddenly, his eyes fixed on a small detailer's scrap of parchment lying partly concealed beneath an ornate footstool. He bent to retrieve it, unfolding the brittle paper carefully. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, nothing like the erratic scrawl of Thomas's confession. Holmes's voice was low but charged with urgency. "Watson, look at this." Watson came close and read aloud. "My dearest Eleanor, by the time you read this, much will have been lost. But know that you carry more than a name, you carry a legacy of love and sacrifice. Trust no one, not even those who claim to protect you." Eleanor's face blanched. I never saw this." Holmes's eyes darkened. "It was hidden with care, yet it carries a warning that could only come from someone very close. Someone with knowledge of the deepest secrets." The room seemed to contract, tension weaving through the air like a living thing. "Who could have written this?" Watson asked, his voice a whisper. Holmes's gaze shifted toward Catherine, who stood at the far side of the room, her posture rigid, eyes avoiding direct contact. Someone who feared their own role would be exposed, he said slowly. He stepped closer to Catherine. You claimed ignorance, loyalty to the Bracknell family, yet you possessed the letter's existence. You sought to protect, but from whom? Catherine's breath caught, her composure cracked. I only wanted to protect the family name. I never intended harm. But harm was done. Holmes countered. You manipulated the forged will, withheld truths, and silenced those who threatened your carefully crafted farade. Catherine's hands trembled. Thomas was my cousin, but I was the one who discovered Eleanor's secret first. I feared the scandal, the ruin. I tried to contain it. Holmes's expression was stern but measured. Containment turned to control. Control turned to desperation. When Thomas faltered, you stepped in to finish the work. Watson's eyes widened. You orchestrated the chaos? Catherine's voice broke. Yes, but not for greed, fear. Fear of losing everything. I never wanted murder, just secrecy. Holmes studied her, his mind racing. Your confession changes everything. The true mastermind was hidden in plain sight, driven by loyalty twisted into fanaticism. He turned to Eleanor, whose shock mingled with relief. You have survived not just one betrayal, but two. Outside, the faint wail of distant sirens approached once more, signaling the final arrival of constables. Holmes folded the letter with deliberate care. Justice must now account for all who conspired, all who concealed. The legacy of the Bracknells is not just in wealth or title, it is in truth. The room held its breath, the last puzzle piece falling into place. And as the night embraced London once again, Holmes allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. The game was over, but only because the final player had revealed themselves. The constables led Catherine Bracknell away in silence, her shoulders squared with the brittle dignity of one who knows the walls have finally closed in. The drawing room fell into a hushed stillness, the air heavy with the ghosts of secrets laid bare. Eleanor, still holding the fragile locket to her chest, remained motionless by the window, her profile outlined against the grey dawn light filtering through the lace curtains. Holmes stood nearby, hands behind his back, his expression unreadable. Watson broke the silence. It's over, then. Holmes didn't respond at once. He studied the floor, then looked up slowly, his gaze fixed on the grandfather clock ticking methodically in the corner. No, he said softly. Not quite. Watson frowned. But Catherine confessed. The letters, the forged will, the threats, she admitted it. Holmes turned to face him. Yes, she confessed, but not to everything. Her role was pivotal yet not absolute. And if we stop here, we fall short of the truth. He crossed the room and lifted a folded piece of paper from the mantel. This, he said, is what troubles me. The second letter, the one warning Eleanor to trust no one. It was elegant, deliberate, not just in the penmanship, but in the tone. That is not Catherine's voice. Watson took the note, reading it again. Then who? Holmes exhaled slowly. It was written by someone who knew Eleanor's entire lineage. Someone who knew Margaret Faulkner. Someone who played the long game, using Catherine as a shield. Watson's face darkened. You mean there's still someone else? Holmes nodded. Yes, and while everyone focused on Thomas and Catherine, the true architect watched quietly from the wings. Someone who never once appeared on our suspect list, because they made certain not to. He turned toward Eleanor. You remember the family's solicitor, Mr. Harrington? Eleanor looked puzzled. Of course. He managed the Bracknell estate since my uncle's passing. He visited often, but always stayed in the background. Exactly, Holmes said. Too far in the background. He was the only one who had access to all documents, the wills, the titles, the financial ledgers. He provided the legal smokescreen that made Catherine's forgeries seem legitimate. Watson's voice was low. And he's gone. Holmes nodded, vanished hours before Thomas's arrest. Quietly, without drawing attention. But he left traces hidden drafts in Catherine's room. The altered legal seals in Charles's study, and a receipt for a private boat charter to Calais. He was behind it all, ensuring everyone else bore the blame. Eleanor looked stricken. He was kind, respectful. Holmes's tone was gentle, but firm. So are the most dangerous puppeteers. They never pull strings in daylight. Watson shook his head. And now he's gone, for now, Holmes said, but not without consequence. I've already wired Lestrade. The port authorities are watching the coast, and the French police have been notified. But if he escapes, Holmes looked toward the door where Catherine had been taken. Then justice may delay, but it won't disappear. He stepped forward and placed the locket gently in Eleanor's hand. This, he said, was never about money or titles. It was about identity, about who you are and what they feared you would uncover. She nodded, tears brimming. And what do I do now? Holmes's expression softened. Live. Live not by what they denied you, but by what you now own truth, outside. The morning sun had finally broken through the mist, casting long slants of gold through the trees. The Bracknell estate stood silent, as though exhaling centuries of secrets. Watson looked over at Holmes. You were right, you know, about the letter, the tone, the pace. I missed it. Holmes gave the faintest smile. So did I. Until I stopped listening with my ears and started reading with my doubt. They stepped outside together, the gravel crunching beneath their feet as the wind picked up. Will they ever truly see the full picture? Watson asked. Holmes glanced back at the grand house. Perhaps not. But they'll feel its weight. And for some, that's punishment enough. The case had closed, yet a single empty chair remained in the grand drawing room, a reminder that even in the neatest resolution, some ghosts chose to linger. The carriage wheels turned slowly beneath the weight of a London dusk, the clatter subdued beneath the rhythmic tapping of Holmes's fingers on the edge of his cane. Beside him, Watson sat quietly, reading through the latest issue of the Times, though his eyes lingered more on the column of smoke, still visible on the city's skyline than on the printed words. The Bracknell estate lay behind them, its windows now shuttered, its secrets uncoiled and laid bare for the world, and yet Holmes's silence spoke of something still unfinished. Watson finally closed the paper. "You did well, Holmes. Even Lestrade said so. And you know how rare that is." Holmes's eyes remained distant. Praise is well enough. But truth has an odd shape, Watson. It bends, sometimes. It falls neatly into resolution. Other times, it curls back on itself like smoke, obscuring what was once clear. Watson raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more?" Holmes tapped the side of his cane thoughtfully. "I think there's always more." The carriage reached Baker Street just as gas lamps flickered to life across the city. As Holmes ascended the familiar steps, Mrs. Hudson handed him a sealed envelope, the wax unmarked. Holmes turned it over in his hands before slicing it open with a letter opener from the mantel. Inside was a small card. No name, no return address, just a single sentence, printed in neat block capitals. "You've caught the puppets, but the stage remains." Holmes read it twice before passing it to Watson, who frowned deeply. A threat? Holmes tilted his head. No, a message, or perhaps an invitation. He moved to the armchair and sat, folding his fingers beneath his chin. "Think back, Watson. Do you recall the maid at the Bracknell estate? The one who vanished just days before the will was discovered." Watson blinked. "Annie Fowler. The girl who reportedly left in the night. You said she was irrelevant, that she'd probably taken employment elsewhere." Holmes nodded slowly. "That was my assumption until this." He gestured toward the card. "She was the only servant who would have overheard Catherine's late-night meetings with Harrington. She had access to the study and reason to fear. What she knew. But why vanish entirely? And why has no trace of her surfaced?" Watson frowned. "You think she's involved? I think she saw something. Perhaps said something. Perhaps was silenced, or perhaps she's the author of this." Holmes rose and moved to his desk, retrieving the scrap of paper on which Eleanor's warning had been written, the one they'd believed Catherine had forged. He placed it side by side with the card. Same ink, same quality of parchment, but look subtle differences in how the capital letters slope. A new hand imitating an old one. Watson leaned closer. Then someone else wrote the warning. Someone trying to help Eleanor without exposing themselves. Holmes nodded. Or someone preserving their place in a larger game. They sat in silence for a long moment, the ticking of the mantel clock the only sound between them. Then Watson spoke, low and hesitant. "Do you think it's over, Holmes?" Holmes stared into the hearth, though no fire yet burned there. "No, my dear fellow, not over. Merely paused. Justice was served. But justice is only ever the surface. Beneath it lies motive, memory, and men, and women clever enough to survive the wreckage." He reached for his violin and began to tune it, the bow drawing a long, low note through the room. Watson leaned back in his chair. "And if the next mystery is already unfolding?" Holmes's mouth twitched into the faintest smile. Then know I'm listening." The sound of the city swelled beneath their window footsteps. Distant bells, the creak of signs swaying above cobbled streets. London, vast and unsleeping, held 1,000 stories at once. And somewhere, perhaps not far, someone else watched Baker Street and waited, because some mysteries do not end. They only take a breath